What's up everybody, how's it going? It's Beck, aka Dansgwait here, and it's time for the final episode of this series, barring any DLC, which definitely seems like it could be a possibility, but in terms of like reviewing the main experience of the game, I'm definitely going to wrap things up here. I don't know if there's going to be a DLC, and I don't know when there's going to be a DLC, so I'm going to assume there won't be one for now, and that will give me an excuse to sit down and talk about my experience, the good, the bad, and my overall conclusion. So with the credits, I already generally gave you guys an idea anyway, and I think most people get the point. But in terms of being able to really sum up more specifically the kind of things I'm talking about with regards to my experience with the game, I always like to make these videos, and it gives me a chance to really sit down and think about what I've experienced and what I liked, what I didn't like, and sort of try to put it all together to give my overall thoughts on the game, having completed it for the first time. So without much further ado, let's get into it. In the background, depending, I might be sharing with you guys basically like a photo album of everything that I've taken throughout the game. Maybe something like that, maybe a little bit of a sort of, I don't know, day-night cycle, some of that kind of stuff. We'll see. So I'll give you guys a little bit of visual as well while I talk about this. So sit back, relax, and listen to my final closing thoughts about Horizon Forbidden West. Let me begin with the good. And with this, I'm literally going to start with the way that the game looks. For me, this was truly the first game that I played on the PS5 that really gave me that wow factor. It looks absolutely stunning, really beautiful, and we've been blessed with some truly beautiful looking games, especially in recent years, as the technology's gotten better and better. And even with Horizon Zero Dawn, I was like, this game looks so great, and especially on PC or like playing it on the PS5, in my mind I was like, there isn't really that much more that you can do with this game in terms of the visuals. Like, how much better can it even look? And then I played Forbidden West, and Forbidden West kind of showed me how much I underestimated what is possible still between the PS4 and the PS5 generation, because I do still feel like there's diminishing returns, and every new generation is going to be less impressive visually compared to the previous, but there is still clearly, in my eyes, room for significant improvement even against the PS4, like the best looking games of the PS4 generation. And it's one of those things where I wasn't really so great at imagining it in my mind, but when I actually got to see what people were doing with it, it really opened my eyes to what is going to be possible on the PS5, especially moving forward. It truly felt next gen, and I felt like the visuals of the game were absolutely spectacular. So that's something that I do think is worthy of mention, because the first game already looked so great, and I love the general aesthetic of the game, that I thought maybe, you know, they're not really going to be able to add so much in that regard. It's just going to be, yeah, I mean, the game looks good. The first one looked good too. This also looks good. But for me, at least, it definitely had like a genuine wow factor, and it really did feel next gen. Now, I think one thing we all know at this stage is that, like I say, we have been spoiled with the technology that we have these days, and games can look so incredible. But now more than ever, I do think art direction and visual style comes into play a lot more. It is definitely easier to make games look photorealistic than they were even 5 years ago. So now, to set yourself apart visually, I think you've got to be bringing some good design to the table as well to really make those visuals work, and to create a world that has visual interest in it as well. And I think in this area, Forbidden West also shines, because I did mention it while playing multiple times that I think the general variety and the world that they built was really beautiful as well. For me, I think there was a particular focus on the tribes. The design of the tribes, like the costumes that they had for them, the face paints, they're all very distinctive, and I really enjoyed like the vibrancy and the different designs. This reflected a lot in the kind of armors, for example, that Aloy could have. I mean, some of them looked truly spectacular, and every time I went into like a different tribe's sort of region, because of the color palettes and the designs and all that kind of stuff, they all felt very distinct to me. And you had like the Utaru, for example, that had much more of that sort of weaved, crafted wooden sort of aesthetic going on. Absolutely beautiful. I really think they did a good job with that stuff. And so not only was the game great visually on a technical level, but I think art design wise they did a good job too. Now, did it truly have the special art design and beauty of a Ghost of Tsushima? I don't think so, but it was still a positive, I think, for the game. And in terms of the different areas we got to see visually, I think it was, again, a step up from Horizon Zero Dawn. We had desert this time. We had like real, like proper desert. We had the coastline, we had basically the San Francisco coast, and we still had like our jungles and our forests and our mountain regions, like we had in Zero Dawn as well. It had a little bit of everything. We had underwater sections. It was just like visually, I think it was a real treat for people who appreciate that aspect maybe a little bit more than the other stuff. Visuals are definitely one of these much more subjective things where some people just really don't care. I mean, they will play a game like Horizon Forbidden West and they'll be much more focused on the story and the gameplay, and even if the visuals were only half as good, it wouldn't affect their experience at all. But for me, I've always been drawn to visually beautiful games, and that's sometimes it can even overpower flaws that the game has. And so I think Forbidden West is one of those games that, for me at least visually, it is very appealing. And I really did enjoy playing it for that aspect too. It was just a treat to be able to play a game so beautiful and explore the world, and to meet the different tribes and see all of the designs and the culture and the history and all of that stuff in the game as well. It's just really cool. So in terms of the gameplay, there were definitely improvements over Zero Dawn. Of course, I'm going to be comparing it a lot to Zero Dawn. It's the direct sequel. And in terms of the general blueprint, it is of course very similar to the first game. Since it's only the second game of a fresh new IP, they weren't exactly going to reinvent the wheel. So I think it's even more fair to compare it to the previous game in that sense. And yeah, there were improvements. I mean, there was definitely some quality of life improvements. For example, even something like when you press the focus, seeing the lines that helped you climb, for example, I thought that was a really simple but easy way to make climbing and traversal more efficient. The way that we could scan the enemies and go through the individual parts in our focus so we could see what we needed a bit more specifically, I thought that was a nice addition. We had the ability to fly, which for me, gameplay-wise, was absolutely huge. If you guys saw those episodes, I got quite excited when we were able to fly, because for me that was just epic. And I didn't think it was going to happen in this game. I mean, I thought they were going to maybe wait for the third one before they introduced flying, but boy am I glad that they did it, because to me, again, with all of the visual stuff that I mentioned, the feeling of being able to like soar over this world and just to look over everything, and obviously the travel benefits that gives you as well, gameplay wise, to me that was a big deal. I really thought that was impressive. Underwater sections were expanded a lot, like we actually could properly dive underwater and experience that aspect too. To me, it wasn't quite as strong as like the flying aspect. The underwater stuff was like, it was cool that they put it in, but I don't think it added a huge amount. But for me, flying was just super cool. I really did enjoy that. We of course had the more obvious stuff, like yes, of course we're going to get new machines to fight against, and I think they were pretty cool. We did have a nice, like a decent amount of variety, because we kept a lot of the ones from the first game and we expanded it further. So we had things all across the range. We had the biggest machines, like we had the Tremor Tusk, we had the Slaughter Spine. Then we had the more medium-sized machines that were also interesting to me, like the Shell Snapper, Frost Claw. I think the Frost Claw was new. Fire Claw, Frost Claw, I think they were new. And then we had the smaller stuff like the Clamberjaws, which pound for pound I think was some of the more difficult enemies in the game. The Sunwing, of course, that you can fly on. So in that sense, of course, it was obvious that they were going to be bringing new machines to the table. But I think they did a good job with them as well and added a decent amount of variety as well. In terms of weapons and gameplay, they tried to go a bit deeper on the melee, and I think they did add a few more ingredients to the melee. Now, obviously, as you would have seen from the playthrough, I still don't think the melee is there. There's maybe more that they can do with that. But I think because of the premise and the nature of the game and the kind of battle style they want to have, I don't think there's ever going to be like truly compelling melee options other than kind of swinging your spear around. There's not going to be too much more to it, I think, than that. But they did make an effort, and of course part of it is on me for not really learning all of the extra new combos and stuff that you can do. So they did expand that, and they did put some effort into including some more. There were new weapons as well. The main one I think I'd probably end up using was the spear, to be honest. Especially the explosive one was very effective for me. I still continue to use my sharp shot bow and my bolt blaster, basically the Rattler from Zero Dawn. So I did stick to a lot of the old stuff, but they did make some innovations. And so they had like the Shredder, for example, which I didn't really use that much. They had the sticky ammo, which I found pretty useful towards the end of the game as well. So yeah, in terms of the gameplay, they definitely added some, both in terms of traversal and in terms of combat as well. So that kind of stuff I definitely think added to it, and I would say probably gameplay-wise, it was better when you consider all of these things compared to Zero Dawn. It was a step up. I think the scale of the world was really impressive. the sheer size of the map was really good, and to me at least, open world games of course always have this thing like it's a big map, but is it just too like barren and empty? Is there any point of having a big map like that? And I think with that stuff it gets a lot more subjective, where for me, for example, if a game is beautiful and the world just looks really, really great and it's just a visual treat to even explore it, then I'm going to enjoy it. But if people are like, well, no, I want there to be like, you know, good settlements everywhere, I want there to be NPCs everywhere, I want there to be quests everywhere, then of course it's much more easy to argue that a world was, let's say, big but felt lifeless or empty or whatever. I personally didn't get that vibe with this game. The map was pretty huge. It was densely populated with life, I think. So it could be like plant life, it could be animal life, it could be tribes, it could be towns, it could be machines. So I do feel like they filled quite a lot of it, and it didn't seem like there was a lot of kind of just empty, bland, pointless map, if you ask me. But of course I admit that part of that is because I am so drawn to the game visually, and even just mindlessly wandering around for 5 minutes and not really interacting with anything too much was still enjoyable for me for pretty much most of the game, because it just looked so good and I really just enjoyed exploring and seeing what the game had to offer in its different regions. So I do think the map size was really satisfactory, and it gave the game a chance to really showcase a whole bunch of different areas and even different seasons basically within the game. So I found it very impressive. In terms of that map, I mean, due to the scale, you really got to have more clearly defined regions. And I think for me a benefit was also recognizing a bit more of what we were seeing in the game. So of course we ended up traveling to like Vegas, for example, which is a place that even if you've never been to it, most of us will generally have an idea of what Vegas looks like, the kind of buildings that it has, and you know, the kind of place it used to be. So being able to see that. Then of course San Francisco was extra special for me, as I mentioned throughout the playthrough, because I've actually been there before. So being able to see this post-apocalyptic vision of San Francisco was really cool for me as well. And it added an extra relatability for me that the first game didn't have to that kind of level. So again, I did appreciate that in terms of the way they built the world as well. So story-wise then, I do think that the general idea of Far Zenith and what they managed to achieve and what actually ended up happening with them, I thought was really cool. So near the start of the game, when we were trying to figure out what the deal was, and like with the spaceship, and I was trying to figure out, did anyone actually end up leaving Earth? Did they survive? Then learning that they did manage to achieve this and that they were on a different planet by a different star, and then they basically figured out how to live eternally and all of these things. To me, it was a lot of that classic sort of sci-fi, really interesting elements that Zero Dawn games, that Horizon games do so well. So I did enjoy that premise a lot, and I think the Far Zenith guys, especially early on in the game, I found them super interesting. And I think that sort of clash between the extreme technology, selfishness and arrogance of Far Zenith versus the post-apocalyptic tribalism that's going on in like that's going on Earth, I thought was a really interesting sort of clash of the different directions humanity can go depending on time and technology and all of these things that become available. So in general, I thought that was definitely cool. I actually enjoyed the team that we had. Like Aloy had a pretty significant team of people around her, especially by the time she got to the end of the game. So having that sort of base where we would collect people, we would basically recruit people over time, and that evolved into something of a team. Going back there and being able to sort of talk to Gaia for like half an hour and have Gaia explain loads of different things about the world and about what Far Zenith's up to and about the history and lore of the game, I found that pretty interesting, and I enjoyed listening to those conversations. Finding out Ted Pharaoh's ultimate fate was also interesting, that quest that we did where we went to his tomb, what he was doing to try and prolong his life, and you know, the pros and cons of that kind of stuff. Again, the moral questions and the conundrums and that kind of thing gave me a lot of that Zero Dawn vibe, which I really enjoyed too. And of course, I think one of the peak areas for me in the game was when we got to speak to Tilda and really find out what the hell the deal was with Far Zenith, and the conversation and the exposition that we had with Tilda I personally found very fascinating, because we of course found out a lot more about Far Zenith and also about Elizabeth Sobek eventually as well, which was really cool. But in terms of the NPCs, I did feel like they were a strong supporting cast in general. Silence for me is a really, really great character. He elevates the game whenever he's in it, if you ask me. His general demeanor the relationship he has with Aloy, where he's one of the only characters in the game that basically doesn't take Aloy's shit in that regard. He always sees himself as superior to Aloy. He's always smarter. He always knows more than she does. He's always calculated more steps ahead than she has. And the way that reflects in their relationship and their conversations, I think it's a brilliant contrast to everyone else who basically kisses Aloy's ass all the time, because she's always saving the day. She's always making the right choice. She's always helping everyone. She's always basically the perfect hero in the game. And so to have Silence kind of in his own way to kind of be able to see through that to some extent, because of course Aloy is not perfect. She's going to make mistakes like everyone else. She has vulnerabilities like everyone else. She has desires like everyone else. And I think Silence is very good at sort of bringing that out of her. And so for me, Silence is always a great character. And the more Silence we have in the game, for me, the better. Alongside that, the rest of the cast, of the others, I think Kotallo, for me, was one of the strongest. Really, really interesting character. He had this really cool, strong warrior charisma, but at the same time, he had a lot of vulnerability and a lot of humility and humbleness as well when it was necessary. And his story with his arm and his attitude towards how he dealt with that situation and how he dealt with it even after he managed to get an arm to replace what he'd lost. For me, Kotallo was an excellent character, and I really enjoyed like going on quests with him, having conversations with him, and that kind of thing. I'm not going to go into every single cast member, but I think of the ones that we did spend time with, I still think the whole thing with Beta was definitely interesting. I get what they were trying to do with Beta and Aloy, and I think, again, it helped bring out something in Aloy that maybe we didn't really get to see so much throughout the game and throughout the story. The way it came to a head, where the two came together and Beta was trying to understand what separates them. They're genetically identical, but why are they so different? And the way that Aloy responded to that, and you got to see how it was like a nurture thing. It was nature versus nurture, and the way that Aloy was nurtured and the way that she's been loved by others and protected, and the way that she has that confidence and self-esteem and that love from people that care about her, the way that that kind of separates them, because Beta unfortunately never got to experience that. To me, that was a really powerful scene, and it brought out a lot of Aloy as well. So I did enjoy having Beta in the story for that reason too. And I definitely think it was a pretty interesting, it was a bold move, but I think they pulled it off and they did a good job with that as well. I will throw in a word for Zoe as well. I thought Zoe was really cool, and I think one of the reasons I enjoyed Zoe particularly as a character was also because of her relationship with the Earth and with the tribe. I think the Utaru in general were really an interesting tribe to me because of their traditions and their relationship with like the sacred machines that they have and that kind of thing. I thought that was dope, and particularly, of course, the seed pouch thing. I freaking love that idea, that sort of circle of life vibe, and the way that we all kind of return to the Earth, and we can help the next generation of organisms and beings to prosper through our own demise. I thought that was, again, really powerful stuff, and the way that everyone carries it, and you know, being able to basically bury someone's seed pouch as like an act of honouring them and that kind of thing. Really powerful stuff. So I did really enjoy Zoe's character, and that sort of culture and that tradition and that tribe that she was a part of. I did find them to be one of the more unique and interesting ones in the game. In general, I think there was a lot more to do in Forbidden West, I think, compared to Zero Dawn. They did take it up a notch in that regard too. I mean, we even had things like board games, which I didn't really engage with. But, you know, the introduction of like the extra combat things that you can do. So it wasn't just a case of, I don't know, go infiltrate 25 bandit camps, and then you've got a few sort of challenges where you have to shoot some arrows at targets within the time limit. They did expand it out. We had the Relic Ruins, we had the Vista Points, we had the melee pit, we had the arena, which I didn't really engage in, but we unlocked it. There was still, of course, the usual like assault course and try to do this in X amount of time. We had mount racing, and we probably had a bunch of other stuff that I've already forgotten. But in terms of things to do, if you're the kind of person that's completely sort of fallen in love with the game and you want that platinum trophy and you're happy to spend like 80 to 100 hours with the game, there's a lot for you to do here, and you won't get bored, and you'll enjoy it. So in that respect as well, I think, again, they weren't overly lazy with that. They did make an effort to try and give players a lot and to give them new things as well that they hadn't experienced before with Zero Dawn. In terms of things to do, of course, we have to talk a little bit about side quests. In general, I think there was a good variety of side quests. I still don't think that the Horizon games are quite like top tier in terms of their side quests. I still think they rely a little bit too much on like repetition and stuff, but we'll get to that later on. In terms of the positive ones, I do think they did have some nice variety. They had some more kind of simple and personal ones, like for example, there was the older lady that had like a love, that had like an old flame, and she was trying to find out what happened to him, and we had to try and find him, and we find out that he's passed away and that kind of thing. To me, little quests like that are sometimes some of the best ones, and I always enjoy doing those. I do feel like they add a bit more of a personal touch and appeal to these kind of games, so I always appreciate that kind of thing. I really enjoyed the quests with Morland and Co. I thought they were probably my favourite like quest-related, like non-super main story-related guys. That trio was really fun to chat to and do quests with, and so they were really cool too. We of course had some good old-fashioned quests where we had to, let's say, go to an area and defeat like a difficult boss. Those are always going to be good and worth doing to a point, but in terms of like throwing in some variety and a little bit of everything, I do feel like they did a decent enough job, and so I'm not unhappy at all with the side quests, but I think in general it is something that probably needs to be taken up another level. So the final thing I'm going to talk about in terms of the good is one of the biggest improvements I think that they made over the first game. Now, I'll be the first to admit that for Zero Dawn, I was so immersed in the story and in the game that it didn't really affect me that much. It wasn't something that I would really call out as like a glaring issue. But once I did complete the game and I started to see more people's impressions of it and reviews on it and that kind of thing, I started to really realize what they were talking about, and I felt that they were justified in their criticism of it. And so it is something that I did think was worthy of improvement. What I'm talking about is, of course, the facial animations and the general kind of directing of dialogue and scenes within the game. Looking back on Zero Dawn, I think there were too many scenes where the characters kind of felt wooden. The facial expressions just didn't really feel right for a lot of the characters that weren't Aloy, for example. Too much kind of standing around and just using the same camera angles back and forth for like 5 minutes while people are talking. It did really feel like they needed to up their game on that front. And in my opinion, they really did in this game. Now, I'm no expert on this, and there's people that feel very strongly about these things and that will kind of break it down to the atomic level. But in terms of the general feeling that I got watching the cutscenes, for me, there was undeniably a step up. There was so much more, like even directing-wise, I think they allowed the scenes to flow a lot more freely in the way that they use the camera, in the way that the characters would act and react to certain things. So, for example, let's just say, I don't know, Tilda and Aloy's conversation on that dining table, where we had exposition for like half an hour or more. The way that they interacted there, for me, it never really got boring or stale, or just kind of felt very like fake or wooden or anything like that. I felt like they had a genuine conversation, and the way that Aloy would sort of, I don't know, she would eat something, or that she would have something in her hand that she was playing with. Sometimes Tilda might stand up or sit down again, and those kind of things. It felt like they paid much more attention to what characters were doing during these conversations, and to me it paid off. The facial expressions were better, especially for people who weren't Aloy in the story, and there was just a lot more action and reaction going on while people were acting out scenes and having conversations. So I do think they definitely took it up another notch, and I do appreciate it in the game. So that was something I think deserves to be commended as well, because that was, I think, one of the most common criticisms that people had of the first game. And again, looking back on it and let's say playing the DLC, for example, in more recent times, I can definitely see it. And so I was very glad that it was something that they improved. So that wraps up in general the things that I have on my mind in terms of things that they did well and that I enjoyed about the game. And so now let's talk about some of the things that I didn't enjoy so much and break down why I feel that way. In talking about the bad, I think I have to start at the end. Now, for me, I think the ending of the game ultimately was a bit underwhelming. Of course, it's with endings, they always try to give you some emotion. That's the place where they want to pack some emotional punch. So in terms of like the initial feeling at the time, the way that we defeat Tilda, we find out there's actually a different threat going on. We think that Silence is walking away, but then Silence decides to rejoin the group. So I personally was really happy that Silence made that decision. The whole group comes together, they're laughing, they're joking. Aaron's got his arm around Aloy, and it seems like, the crew is basically all there. The crisis has been avoided, and we live to fight another day. And so that general feeling was, of course, positive, and I felt good. having completed the game. But in terms of how everything was structured and how it could have been, ultimately I wasn't as satisfied as I would have liked to have been. So for me, first of all, the final mission, there was too much Spectre fighting. This is supposed to be Far Zenith. They spend the entire game telling us how technologically advanced they are. And to be honest, the only machine that we fought that we know are made by Far Zenith basically was the Spectre and Spectre Prime. So for me, like, I get it. You could of course argue that they basically built one machine that can do it all anyway. They didn't need any other machines. But we're playing a game, right? You know, if that was the logic, then you don't really need that much machine variety in the game anyway. I'm sure they didn't need to have Clamberjaws. They could have found a machine that could have done the job that they did, right? So in terms of variety, I would have loved to have seen more variety for the final mission. We essentially just fought Spectres over and over again, and I think that was an opportunity wasted, because we'd already fought Spectres throughout the game anyway. So the fact that they recycled them so much for the finale, to me, was a bit strange, and I think they missed a trick in terms of the gameplay for the final mission. There was just too much Spectres, and I think they needed to change that up. Maybe introduce like a new machine that we haven't seen at all. At least have like 2 or 3 other machines to throw into the mix. I definitely would have preferred that. And for me personally, that was a letdown in terms of the gameplay. Also, in terms of what they did with the story, ultimately I felt like they were maybe being a bit too... To me, it felt very transparent that they already had the third game in mind while making the second, if that makes sense. Of course, they have to do that to a degree anyway, because you have to structure the story accordingly. But it felt like they were too focused on setting up the third game instead of giving us a great ending to game 2. That's the feeling that I got when I was playing. The reason I feel like that is just because they spent the entire game hyping up Far Zenith, and they tried to do this whole like bait and switch thing where they were like, oh, it turns out that Far Zenith was never the true big threat all along. And then they introduced this sort of really hard to define, wishy-washy, true cataclysmic threat right at the end when we were busy thinking about other things and trying to deal with the ending of the game. They kind of threw that all in there, and it sort of cheapened everything that I think was going on with Far Zenith and their story. And so it was kind of like, it was almost like a, you know, OG Super Mario, your princess is in another castle kind of ending. And so I didn't personally enjoy that as much, because not only was it a bit difficult to understand, because it's like we have this sort of, we don't even truly know what the threat is. Like, it's this sort of collection of consciousnesses that have been abandoned and they've gone rogue, and they're on this mission to destroy, like, they're chasing Far Zenith, but in doing so they're going to destroy basically every planet they encounter in their path. Like, it was just a bit too much. I don't know, it just felt a bit cheap and a bit like not as clear as I would have liked at the end. It just was not a very strong ending in my opinion, and it was too much of an effort to sort of say, hey guys, you know, Far Zenith, you guys thought they were the bad guys, but hey, there's this much bigger threat. Wait until game 3 comes along where you try to defeat an even bigger threat. And it was just like, I don't know, it came too much at the expense of having a really quality ending to the second game, in my opinion. So the ending didn't really blow me away. It was decent, it was fine, but it could have been much stronger in my opinion. So the ending I don't think was really great. In terms of the gameplay, I think one of the things that probably still stands out for me is that it felt too much to me like they were trying to force the player to play a certain way when it came to certain traversal and puzzle aspects. I just kept running into that, where I was like, the game looks very open, and it looks like you have a lot of options and a lot of different ways to get from A to B, or to achieve something that you want to do. And ultimately you end up wasting a lot of time because you didn't do one specific thing the game wanted you to do. So when it came to like Relic Ruins, for example, that was where I noticed it the most, where I felt like they tried too hard to create this really specific blueprint for how to do it that didn't really give players much agency in how they tackled the problem. And so it ended up making things a bit more sort of formulaic, and things dragged on, and sometimes they wanted you to do something very specific, but to me at least it wasn't really obvious what it was. And so you end up running around for 5-10 minutes trying all these other things, and it turns out it was just a waste of time, and that there was another way to do it, the only other way to do it, and then you basically just wasted time. So in terms of Relic Ruins, I ended up being a bit disappointed in the end. You could just say it was me being stupid, sure, okay, but honestly, that it didn't feel like that to me. I mean, I've not played puzzle games for the first time, And so I do feel like they could have done a little bit better in terms of how they structured some of the relic ruins, and even some of like the quests where you were required to get from A to B or to do something more specific. Sometimes I felt like they tried a bit too hard and made it a bit too intricate when it wasn't necessary, which did annoy me sometimes. So that was one thing that was a little bit annoying. Like the relic ruins, even after I got all of the orbs, because I got them scattered throughout the game, I wasn't really keeping up that much with the story. It's like, yeah, it's these bunch of people that are sending a big FU to one of their superiors, and they've gone on this road trip, and they've left behind these fragments. But considering how much time you had to dedicate to get them all, if you're playing without a guide, the story, the lore there, to me wasn't really that satisfying. I did read them all, like after, when I was editing, I made sure I kind of ran through all of the story and all of the orbs back to back. And honestly, to me it was pretty weak, like it wasn't that interesting. So yeah, the relic ruins in general, it was something I was really looking forward to, because the ruins themselves sometimes look really cool, and that kind of bit more puzzly style does appeal to me in these games sometimes, but I ended up being pretty underwhelmed. And it did reflect in some of the other quests as well, in terms of what they wanted you to do with the traverse and the gameplay, and unlocking certain things or finding things, etc. Another thing that was not quite what I wanted for this game was to do with the story and the lore. Now, I'm not saying this because it was bad necessarily, but the game sets a very high benchmark in a lot of areas, and the first game especially was tremendous. So for me, I hold it to a high standard. So if there's something that was for me below par, or even just par for the course, like not particularly great, for me it's still worth pointing out on the more negative side, because I do feel like it's an area that perhaps could have been better. So in terms of that stuff, the story in general, I think the gripe that I had was more to do with the ending and the way that they tried to wrap up everything with Far Zenith, and then suddenly introduce this other threat that I generally didn't like. There were too many phases where like Silence would go missing for a really long time. The way that they tried to pull together this sort of tribal situation, you had like Regala, who ended up being a bit of a pawn in the grand scheme. I felt like they could have done more with Regala. It was this sort of constant layer upon layer of insignificance. Like, you have Regala fairly early in the story, and you feel like Regala is going to be a pretty serious like adversary and an important figure. Like, you're going to be defeating her maybe in the finale of the game, who knows. And then it turns out that Regala was basically a pawn in Silence's game, and that's fine. And then you say, okay, well, now the real threat, well, even ignoring Regala completely, the real threat is Far Zenith. Okay, fine. So let's put all of our effort into Far Zenith. And then you're like, nah, actually Far Zenith isn't the threat. It's this like ball of angry consciousness that's the real threat. It just wasn't quite as good, in my opinion, as the first game. It wasn't really there. It did have its general moments, of course, where I was really engaged and interested in finding out more about the story and what happened and stuff. But I think as a whole, it didn't quite hold up quite as well as the first game's story. I think another area where, for me, I found it difficult to enjoy it as much as the first was because it didn't quite have the same world building and lore magic that the first game did. The first game did such a fantastic job of establishing kind of what was going wrong in the world. You have a lot of stories and a lot of lore about, let's say, things like climate change and how that affected the world, and then you have the Pharaoh Plague and the ambitions of someone like Ted Pharaoh and people that were creating machines to fulfill all these purposes, how that all went wrong. And then of course you have Project Zero Dawn, all of the players that were involved in that, the sacrifices that needed to be made, the moral conundrums, the different personalities, the different perspectives. For me, all of that stuff was super, super fascinating, and it really drew me to the game heavily. Now with this one, they laid so much of that groundwork that there's only so much that they could have done with it. They can't tell the same story twice. And so with me, one of the concerns I always had was, how are they going to do in terms of the world building and the lore and the story? And for me, again, like I say, it just didn't quite live up to what they did in the first game. And I get why. And I think they tried to compensate for that somewhat by having these Far Zenith guys appear, because through that they had this entirely new lore to be able to tell. A lore that we weren't aware of in the first game, because we didn't know that Far Zenith basically existed and that they were successful in what they did. So the stuff that we did get about Far Zenith and their story, to me, was fascinating. And that's why I did enjoy like speaking to Gaia, finding out more about who they were, how they managed to achieve what they did, and how do we take them down. What is the current state of the situation? Like in general, I did enjoy all of that stuff. Finding out about Tevura's fate also was interesting. So there was some of that stuff scattered in, but as like an overall story, to me, it just never reached the same heights that Zero Dawn did, unfortunately. And so part of that I think was unavoidable because of just how good Zero Dawn was in that respect, and what they managed to set up with that. But I do feel like, of course, when they were thinking about the story and the world building, there might have been more things that they could have done to just give it that little bit more in that respect. So yeah, again, obviously just my opinion, but I do feel like they were a step below Zero Dawn with respect to the story, the world building, and the lore. To me, I think another way in which that sort of thing manifests is the way that they utilized or didn't utilize the other party members of the game, basically, like the other supporting cast members. I mentioned this and I stand behind it. I still think they missed a trick in a serious way with the way that they didn't use the focus to allow them to communicate. The way that the game basically kind of forced you to go back to the base. The conversations you had with Gaia for me were productive because you were finding out more about the world and more about, like, I don't know, Project Zero Dawn, the other AIs, Far Zenith, what everyone's up to, that kind of thing. That was fine. But when you add in the fact that you've got like 5 supporting characters in there that all have this big massive ball of conversation where it's just like, oh, so how's this person doing? How's your relationship with this person? What have you been up to lately? All of this kind of small talk stuff that I engaged in because I still prefer to try and engage in as much conversation as I can and build as much kind of story and rapport with my companions as I can. I still think it was a poor implementation. So much of what we were forced to kind of sit through in the base could have been done through the focus. Aloy could have been getting regular updates on what people's doing. So maybe, I don't know, Erend and Zoe had a heated debate and a fight broke out between them. Val could tell us about this on the focus while we're trying to do a mission, for example. Because the game is so big and so much of it's traversal based, I feel like a lot of time to do all of this stuff was missed. And so it ended up forcing us to kind of have these breaks in the game where we'd have to take an hour off to kind of catch up with everyone and see what was going on. I just feel like that was a poor implementation. And as a result, I think we felt more disconnected from our party members than we should have been. Since we literally have the technology to communicate with each other whenever and wherever we want, I feel like it was just a really strange omission to not have those guys more involved in the story in that kind of sense. And for me, Erend was the most egregious offender here because I feel like Erend was basically brought along for the ride. He didn't really contribute. I mean, I feel like that with Erend it's difficult because he's clearly a fun character. He's someone that cares a lot about Aloy, and Aloy cares a lot about him. He does add an extra level of banter to whatever group he's in, so I like having him around. But I think when you build Aloy up to be so powerful, and you build the threat up to be so big, I feel like Erend with his big hammer and his like Asuram attitude, I think deep down we all know that he's just not powerful enough. He doesn't contribute enough in terms of like the grand scheme of things to really matter that much. And I think the game is kind of struggles sometimes to place him. Like, is he suitable for this quest? Should he be around right now? If it's just him and Aloy, battle-wise, how much is he actually contributing? I feel like they're struggling to kind of place him in the story in that sense. And so I think in this game it was a good example. Like, he spent the lion's share of the game just sitting in the base, and then telling you about how he's struggling to use the focus and just kind of bantering and debating and sometimes arguing with his other party members. It just wasn't enough. I feel like he was pretty much like a passenger, and at times he was wasted. He didn't even really have like a big solo quest that we went on with him. So like, at least with Katala we had his old narrative about the arm and getting him a new arm and all the dialogue related to that. I thought that was really cool. We had Zoe's story with her tribe and trying to help her and that kind of thing. With Erend, we basically ended up getting almost nothing. So for me, again, with that supporting cast and the way that they implemented the base, it just wasn't there. And I think, again, that's indicative of this game just not quite having the kind of world building and the storytelling that it could have had, and I think it probably should have had as well. So I think that's one of the areas in which I genuinely think it missed the trick, and it was a little bit disappointing. So I do think that in the next game they need to do better on that front, because they've got so much of it right. I think the characters themselves are not bad. Like I say, I think Eren's really funny. I mean, I generally, pretty much every piece of dialogue or scene he's involved in, he'll like make me scoff or laugh in some kind of way. So I like having that in a game. I do think it's important. No matter how high the stakes are, having that one guy who's a bit more of a joker, laid back and just has that kind of attitude, I always appreciate that. But in terms of integrating him into, especially the second game, like the story of this game, it feels like everything's kind of over his head. Like Far Zenith are too technological, they're too powerful, they're too smart, like everything is just, it goes over his head. So I feel like they need to find a better way to include the supporting cast for Aloy sometimes. Of course, for the final mission, they all came together and it was like this kind of squad kind of situation, and yeah, that was good in a way. But I do feel like the game maybe suffers a little bit from that, because Aloy is just too OP compared to everyone else while they're trying to have this kind of, you know, group effort going on. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to deal with that in the next game, but I do hope it's something that they improve a little bit. I think with the first game, Aloy was still kind of learning the ropes herself, and she was still new to a lot of things and trying to discover the world and who she is and what she has to do, what her destiny is, and that kind of thing. I think it fit in a little bit more because Aloy was also not as established. But especially in this game, she's basically become like this almost demigod figure, where everywhere she goes, she solves every problem, she defeats everybody, she's always in control, she always has the right answer, she knows what she's doing, everyone looks to her for advice, and she becomes like the de facto leader of every tribe she ends up doing quests for. So when you combine this level of power with her sort of buddies, finding that balance between them I think is difficult, and this game didn't quite, I think, nail it on that front. In terms of the quests, again, it's something I always mention. I still think the quests as a whole are not quite at that sort of A tier level. They're like a B grade, I would say. They're good, they're fine. I did enjoy doing them, and I did do a lot of them, but they still aren't at that top level for me. There's still too much quest repetition. Again, to each their own here. Maybe some people, they just don't care. They'll do they could be 500 of the same quest and they'll just do all 500. That's obviously up to you. But for me, the game has to somehow find a way to maybe even have less quests, but just improve the variety and improve the premises for them. So again, that whole situation where you speak to an NPC and they say, oh, there's this person that I care about who has gone missing while they were trying to do this particular quest. Can you please find them and see what their fate was? There's only so many of those, I think, that you can have in the game before you just stop caring. And so for me, that threshold is, let's say, 5 quests throughout a game, where the premise is like that. Obviously, I didn't count this, but in terms of how it felt like this game maybe had 10 of those or 15 of those. And so it did cause me to have more quests where I was like, you know what, I just don't really care about this. Even if it was something very simple and something quirky or something funny, I'm more likely to go for that as a quest than, let's say, find the missing person number 8, right? So for me, in that sense, this game has never quite been there. I think it was the same for Zero Dawn, and I don't think Forbidden West has quite cracked it either. It's probably a little bit better than Zero Dawn, but still not at that top level that I think it could be at. I definitely think the potential is there, but I don't think they've got there yet. So for the next game, again, I'm hoping for slightly more variety in the quests, maybe less overall, but just more of those like small weird little quests potentially, and less of the whole someone's gone missing, please find them, or like, oh, we need to go and beat up this machine in order to get this resource. Of course we need those quests, and there should be those quests, but as a ratio of the total, I do think that they can maybe change it up a little bit more as well. In terms of the gameplay and the combat, I think I'm not going to go too deep into this because in general I enjoyed it, and it plays a lot like Zero Dawn. There's not that much difference between them. Again, only the second game in a new IP, so they don't need to reinvent the wheel. In general, I've always enjoyed the gameplay, and I like the idea of having the machines as enemies. Stealth elements are still generally fine, nothing groundbreaking here, but it plays well, and I don't have any major gripes with it. The only minor thing I would say is that maybe the implementation that they have with scanning an enemy and then being able to scroll through literally 6 or 7 different pages, in terms of the amount of information it gives, is useful, but in battle situations, it only really works well, for me at least, if the opportunity to kind of hide in some grass and inspect the area first. That's fine, but when it's a more intense situation, the idea that you have to kind of focus on an enemy and then you have to scroll through pages and you have to check out what each part can do while you're trying to evade the enemy that's constantly charging at you and you're being attacked from all sides, to me that doesn't really work so well. I don't know how they fix that issue. Maybe they need to have some kind of more permanent overlay kind of thing, some part of the UI or the HUD, like you scan it once and then you have it permanently visible at the top so you don't have to keep your focus on it to scroll through the different parts to see like which one is potentially beneficial to blow up or to salvage or whatever it might be. For me that wasn't really that efficient. Hectic battles don't really work as well for gameplay in my opinion, for Forbidden West and Zero Dawn anyway. And so when you throw in this sort of time-consuming focus to scan through everything, to me it just doesn't quite work as well. So I think they need to find maybe a slightly different implementation for that stuff in the future. And maybe give us like another option for the quicker enemies that bounce around a lot, because I think it still maybe sometimes relies a bit too much on just grabbing an arrow and shooting like a small, precise, weak area of an enemy that's jumping around constantly, and that can be very difficult. And the variation between, like, let's say you shoot in a weak spot, you do like 400 damage, but then you fire 5 pixels to the right and you do like 4 damage instead. The variation is so high that sometimes it does get a bit frustrating. And I do think that maybe they need to be a little bit more either lenient or just give you like different tools, and that's why I love the Bolt Blaster so much. It gives you that margin for error. Or for example the exploding spears where you just have to hit the enemy, and provided that you hit them in general you're still able to do good damage. So I found workarounds for it, and that's why I say this is like a very minor kind of issue, but I do think it's something that maybe can be tweaked a little bit more for the third game as well. So the final thing that I think is worth pointing out is you guys would have seen and heard that there were some bugs and glitches in the game. Now overall, would I say that it was like, oh, it's such a buggy and glitchy game? I would say no. Definitely not in that category. And again, considering the ambition of the game, the scale of the game, the fact that there wasn't even that much of a big delay between this one and Zero Dawn, it was barely, like, it was less than 5 years between the two of them coming out. And the fact that I played it on launch day, I think it held up really well. So in general, I will say that. But did we notice some bugs and glitches? We definitely did. For me, I think the most obvious ones were the ones to do with the sound and the dialogue, where we had random like dialogue appearing where it shouldn't, maybe like repeated dialogue when it shouldn't have repeated. I think we had like 1 or 2 times where like Aloy screamed like randomly when she shouldn't and stuff. It was a bit weird. We did see some odd things going on with the audio sometimes. Definitely did happen. Visually, we had very few glitches. I think there was one that was like where the screen would like the lighting would change. It would end up being super bright sometimes. I don't remember it clearly at this stage, but there was one visual glitch that I needed to shut the game down and reset it to get it to work again. So there were definitely a few like bugs and glitches going on, but nothing like really significant or game breaking or that I think was worthy of like, you know, docking the game a point for or anything like that. So yeah, nothing significant, but I think it would be a bit unfair to say that the game was flawless on that front and it had no bugs or any glitches or anything like that. It did happen, but it was definitely minor in my opinion. Right then, so after being negative about the game for a chunk, let me bring it all together and tell you why I still really enjoyed this game and I still think it's a really, really good game. Overall, I think this game had a lot to live up to. I mean, in terms of new IPs, Horizon Zero Dawn was one of the most successful ones that we've seen in recent times. It sold incredibly well, it reviewed incredibly well, and on a personal level, I really love the game. I still believe it's one of the best games of the PS4 generation. I really do. The story, I'm not going to go too deep into it, of course, but Horizon Zero Dawn I thought was a truly, truly great game. And of course, you have to frame it within the context of it being a first effort for a new IP. So to be a sequel to that was already going to be a big task. They were in this unique position where, yes, there were definitely areas of improvement that were relatively clear, but so much of the game was great and the blueprint was generally strong. So I think it could have been very easy for them to just rest on their laurels and be pretty lazy with this game and basically make a carbon copy of Horizon Zero Dawn and just ship that out and just basically make all the money. And in my opinion, in that sense, this game was a triumph. A lot of the criticisms they had from the first game, namely, let's say, the facial animations and, you know, the cutscene directing and that kind of thing, I think was vastly improved in this game. They definitely did a good job with that. And I think throughout the game you can tell that there was a lot of heart and a lot of effort put in to try to make the best game that they could. I didn't feel like they were trying to cut corners or try to just be lazy with the game or just try to give us essentially the same game twice. There were a lot of meaningful improvements to the game, and they were ambitious in what they wanted to do with it. You know, the size of the world map, the added traversal stuff, the fact that you can fly in the game, for example. I'm sure adding like flying mechanics is not like a small thing for a developer to do in an open world game. It does make a big difference, I'm sure. The amount of extra side quests, the amount of extra things they brought in, like the board game, for example, the arena, all of these kind of things. We had a lot more underwater going on as well. It was a big, long story with a lot of characters, a lot of dialogue. We had all the different tribes and all their different locations and their different aesthetics. We had like literally desert, coastline, mountains, jungle, forest, all in the same game. I don't think you could call these guys lazy or unambitious with what they tried to do with the game. They definitely had a vision, I think, of trying to keep what made Horizon Zero Dawn great, but really make use of the PS5 and also have a chance to address some of the criticisms and some of the flaws of the first game. So I definitely really commend them for what they tried to do with this game. That's why I think in terms of just looking at it from a very like technical, objective level, this game is definitely better than Horizon Zero Dawn. I mean, to me that much is clear. It looks better, the gameplay is better, the open world is bigger, but there's also more to do than there was in Zero Dawn. The facial animations are better, it's better directed. I think the soundtrack is actually pretty good. The soundtrack might be better than the first game. There's a greater variety of machines, there's a greater variety of weapons. Like, when you look at it from those kind of more technical standpoints, to me it's pretty obvious that this game is better than Zero Dawn. But then you have to answer the question, but why is it then not a better game overall? And I think that's why this game and Zero Dawn, they're very interesting to sort of compare and contrast. What was interesting to me was, once I got towards the end of the game, and right now, my feeling is that I rate the games very similarly, but for different reasons. Because from all the stuff that I've listed to you, this game should be better rated than Zero Dawn, but in my mind it isn't. It's of the same kind of level. And what was interesting on that front was that when I looked at something like, let's say, Metacritic, the critic review scores average for the two games was almost identical. I think they're either identical or like 1 point difference or something like that. They're very, very close. So when it comes to like critical review scores, of course, you've got to take them with a grain of salt. Sometimes a giant boulder of salt. But I think when it comes to Forbidden West and Zero Dawn, I think they've actually got it right when you look at the average. Because despite the fact that this game is an improvement in so many ways, there is this sort of undeniable quality and magic, especially for a debut effort of Zero Dawn, that still makes it special and better than the sequel. We all know that there's certain intangibles to games. Not everything is always about the technical and the gameplay aspects, for example. It's about the characters, it's about the story, it's about the world, it's about the lore, it's about the twists and turns, it's about all of those kind of things too. And I think when you start to add in more of the story and the lore and the world building aspects, I still think for me, Zero Dawn was superior. Now it has the advantage of being the fresh entry. For me, it was something that I hadn't really come across before because it looks so familiar in so many ways, but it also had this like high-tech sci-fi kind of aspect to it as well, right? Where we were like dealing with machines, we were dealing with like incredible technologies and AIs and that kind of thing, but there were still like jungles and bow and arrows and all of this kind of stuff. So the first game definitely had the benefit of that sort of freshness, and so it was always going to be hard for the second game to live up to it. But hey, I mean, the people making these games, they're such geniuses that there's always ways to sort of overcome those things and make an even better game. But did Forbidden West achieve it on that front? I don't think so. And so that's why when I have like an overall kind of thought about the game, I still believe it's in the same ballpark as the first. It's not better than the first in my opinion. But of course that's not exactly a big criticism on the game because I really love the first one and I still think this game is really, really great too. I think if I had to absolutely choose one, I think because of what appeals to me personally more, I'd probably still go with Zero Dawn as my favorite, but only by like a smidge. And that's just mainly because of that story. I just love that story too much, and the lore and the world building for me was just superior in the first game. And so I just can't deny that that is an important enough aspect for me that it just tips it over the edge, regardless of the extras that Forbidden West has over the first game. So yeah, in general, that's my feelings. Again, it was a long, rambly video, but games these days are so long, they're so big, there's so much to talk about, that I feel like it's best to just sit down and try to go through as much of it as I can, because I won't be doing this again in terms of like reviewing Forbidden West. So I feel like while I'm at it, I just talk about pretty much everything that I can think of. I am generally excited for the future of this game, because now I feel like we're in this kind of interesting position where the second game has a lot of the technical aspects on point, and the first game has a lot of the story and the lore and the world building aspects on point. Of course, what I would love to happen is for the third game to fuse together the two, and we have the best of both worlds, and then maybe the third game is the one where it really basically appears on a lot of those all-time lists for players. I feel like in the modern era, there's certain games, when I say modern era, okay, I'm talking like the last 10-15 years, like PS3 onwards basically, where there's certain games where everyone knows, even if you haven't played them yourself, or if you haven't enjoyed them yourself even, you respect the fact that these are some of the greatest games of all time. And if anyone considers them as such, you might disagree with them on a personal level, but you can't deny the quality and the greatness of the games as a general. So I mean, I'm talking about games like, let's say, I don't know, Red Dead Redemption. I've never played it, but there's no way I can really diss Red Dead Redemption, because I know that it's so acclaimed, and so many people that I know that have played it have said it's a phenomenal game. So that's one, you know, like God of War, The Last of Us, Elden Ring, Zelda Breath of the Wild, Witcher 3. These kind of games are in that real like S tier. I feel like Horizon so far, it hasn't quite hit that level. It's good enough that I think people individually can put it there, and that's fine. But I think as like a collective, like a, you know, the gaming world, I don't think it puts it up there on that level, and I don't think it deserves quite to be there just yet. But I do have hope that if the third game brings together the best of the first and the second, and builds upon what it's already achieved so far, that third game could be the special one that really ends up being the absolute pinnacle of the series, and starting to get into that conversation of being in like the top, I don't know, 20 games of all time, for example. As it stands right now, I don't think it's there, but it's not a million miles away either. So that's the general feeling I have. I'm excited for the third game. I do feel like the gaming world generally likes trilogies, so I could see the third one being the last one in Aloy's story. And for that reason, it could definitely go out with a bang. And at least in terms of like the ending, for example, I feel like there's a greater chance of them giving us a grandstand, incredible finale instead of what we got in this game personally. So that's how I'm generally feeling, looking forward to that. And if this game's anything to go by, I think there's a strong chance that we might not have to wait like 10 years to see it. The turnaround time for Forbidden West I thought was pretty damn good, considering how long AAA open world games can take to make nowadays. I thought it was really impressive. So maybe in like the next 5 years again, we might have that next Horizon game, and it might just be the best one yet. So I'm going to sign off here. Thank you all so much to everyone that's joined me. It's been another incredibly long series. It's been like a blessing and a curse on the channel. I've had so much. There's been so much like great content to play, like combining this with Elden Ring, that those two games together have been over 200 hours of quality, sometimes like all-time level great gaming. I mean, it's been a blessing in that sense. But in terms of obviously the workload, the sheer amount of content I've had to upload, and how long the series are for you guys to watch, has of course been a bit of a curse on that sense, because they've been so incredibly long. But that's why I appreciate everyone that's been watching it so much. I know it's been difficult. I know you've had to wait a long time to get this far, but I've done my absolute best to try to kind of keep everything going on the channel while not compromising on the quality and the workflow that I bring to the table. Everyone does their thing differently, but this is the way I know how to do it. And maybe in the future I'll try to see if there's maybe some changes that I can make to try to upload these games more quickly. But in general, this is the way I know how to do it. This is how I've grown the channel. This is how the channel's become successful. And so this is how I'd like to continue doing it, even if it comes at the expense of these series taking a long time to do. And well, if you're watching it up until this point, then you clearly respect that grind, and you're happy to wait if necessary as well. So really appreciate that. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you had a good time with Forbidden West as well. And I'll be seeing you with more content in the future. Maybe some DLC. We shall see. I mean, the game is so big that I feel like there's a good chance that we'll see some DLC too. But probably going to be in 2023 would be my guess. So thank you all for watching. I will see you soon. Take care.